The dust from the road had settled into a fine, gritty film on every surface of my life. It was in my car, on my clothes, and I felt it in the back of my throat, a permanent taste of displacement. My apartment in the city was gone, packed into a storage unit that felt more like a tomb for a life I no longer knew how to live. All that was left was this temporary job, a lifeline thrown by a distant family friend, cataloging a century's worth of ranch ledgers and correspondence for a historical society grant. It was absurd. I knew more about obscure postmodern poets than I did about cattle, but it came with a room and 3 meals a day, and for the moment, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was a place to hide. I stood by the aging sedan that had carried me here, a dark blue blot against the endless gold and brown of the landscape. The main house was 100 yards away, a sprawling, low-slung building of dark wood and stone. Barns and outbuildings were scattered around it, like fallen dominoes. It was a world unto itself, governed by the sun and the seasons, and I was an alien dropped into its orbit. The quiet was the first thing that struck me. Not silence, but a living quiet, filled with the hum of insects, the distant lowing of cattle, and the sigh of wind through tall, dry grass. It was a sound that made the noise of my own anxiety seem deafeningly loud. That was when I saw him for the first time. He wasn't walking from the house or a truck. He seemed to emerge from the landscape itself, a figure of dirt and denim and purpose. He moved with an economy of motion I'd only ever seen in films, each step sure and weighted. He was the ranch foreman, a man named Cole. I only knew that from the brief email exchange with the owner. The name had sounded simple, solid. The man looked it. He stopped about 10 feet away, his thumbs hooked into the front pockets of his worn jeans. His face was shadowed by the brim of a dusty Stetson, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't hostile, not exactly. It was assessing. He was taking inventory of me, the city creature with soft hands and a nervous energy that probably radiated off me in waves. "You're Leo," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a slow-moving river. It seemed to fit the landscape perfectly. "Yeah, that's me." My own voice sounded thin, reedy. I cleared my throat, the grit still there. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Rooms in the bunkhouse. West End. I'll show you." He didn't wait for a reply, just turned and started walking. I grabbed my bags, stumbling a little on the uneven ground, and hurried to catch up. I was acutely aware of the sounds I was making, the scuff of my inappropriate shoes, the wheeze of my own breath. He made no sound at all. His presence was a quiet, solid thing, a stark contrast to the buzzing uncertainty that filled my own head. This was his world, and for the next 3 months, I was just a temporary, out-of-place guest in it. I followed him toward the bunkhouse, my world shrinking to the space between his broad shoulders, already wondering how I was going to survive. The bunkhouse was long and simple, smelling of clean linen, old wood, and something faintly like soap. My room was at the very end, as promised. It was Spartan, a single bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden desk, a chair, and a window that looked out over a vast, empty pasture. It was more than I expected. Cole set my largest bag down inside the door with an ease that made me feel flimsy. "Dinner's at 7 in the main house," he said, his gaze sweeping the small room once, as if checking for flaws. "Don't be late. Martha doesn't hold meals." He turned to leave, and for a second, I felt a ridiculous pang of panic. He was my only point of contact in this alien world, and he was about to disappear. "Thanks," I managed to say. He paused in the doorway and looked back at me. This time, the light from the setting sun caught his face. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue, the color of a winter sky, and they were framed by fine lines etched from years of squinting into the sun. His expression was unreadable, a flat, neutral mask of competence. But the intensity of that brief look held me in place. It felt like he was seeing more than just the nervous man with the city clothes. It felt like he was seeing the whole mess of me. Then he gave another one of his curt nods and was gone, his footsteps receding down the long wooden porch. I was left alone in the quiet room, the scent of dust and his faint, clean smell, something like cedar and dry earth, lingering in the air. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and sank onto the bed, the springs groaning in protest. The silence rushed back in, but now it was different. It was filled with the echo of a low voice and the memory of a steady, unnerving gaze. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. My work was in a small, dusty office off the main living area of the house, a room filled with cardboard boxes overflowing with brittle, yellowed paper. I spent hours hunched over ledgers, my world shrinking to the spidery script of men long dead, their lives recorded in notations of cattle sold, fences mended, and winters survived. It was methodical, solitary work, and it suited the part of me that wanted to disappear. I was a ghost, sifting through the lives of other ghosts. But my real occupation became watching Cole. From the window of my small office, I had a clear view of the main yard, the corrals, and the path to the largest barn. I saw him every day. I watched him move with that same unhurried grace, whether he was calming a spooked horse with a low murmur and a firm hand on its neck, or effortlessly lifting hay bales that looked like they weighed as much as I did. He was a man in constant, purposeful motion. There was nothing wasted, nothing for show. Every action had a clear, defined reason. I learned the cadence of his days. The early mornings, when I'd see him crossing the yard in the pre-dawn gloom, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand. The long afternoons spent on horseback, a distant figure moving along a ridge line. So far away he was just a silhouette against the enormous sky. The evenings, when he'd sit on the top rail of a corral fence, rolling a cigarette with practiced, deliberate movements, the tiny orange glow the only point of light in the deepening twilight. He rarely spoke to me directly. We saw each other at meals, of course. Breakfast and dinner were communal affairs in the big kitchen of the main house, presided over by Martha, the owner's sister, a woman with a sharp tongue and a kind heart. The other hands were a blur of loud laughter and easy camaraderie, a club to which I would never belong. They talked about livestock and weather and rodeo gossip. I ate in silence, feeling my otherness like a physical weight. Cole sat at the head of the long wooden table, a quiet king in his court. He ate with the same focus he applied to everything else. He listened more than he talked, his gaze moving from man to man, occasionally interjecting with a quiet question or a direct order that was never disputed. Sometimes, I would feel his eyes on me. It was never for long, just a flicker of a glance across the table. But it was enough. My fork would still in my hand. The hum of conversation would fade into a dull buzz. I'd feel a hot flush creep up my neck. I would try to decipher the look. Was it pity? Annoyance? Simple curiosity about the strange creature in their midst? His expression gave nothing away. It was as vast and unreadable as the plains that stretched out from the ranch in every direction. My mind, however, was anything but empty. It was a frantic, desperate landscape of analysis. He looked at me for 3 full seconds that time. That's longer than yesterday. Does that mean something? Or does it mean he thinks I'm a freak for just staring at my plate? He adjusted his hat when he looked away. A nervous gesture? No, not him. He's never nervous. It was probably just an adjustment. A simple, meaningless adjustment. My internal monologues were exhausting. I was taking these tiny, insignificant scraps of interaction and trying to build a feast from them. I was starving for connection, and he was the only thing on the menu that held any interest. I knew it was foolish. I knew it was a projection, a fantasy spun from loneliness and the sheer, undeniable force of his physical presence. But I couldn't stop. One afternoon, I was walking back from the main house to the bunkhouse, my head full of 19th century cattle prices. I wasn't watching where I was going, my gaze fixed on the dusty tips of my own boots. I stumbled on an exposed tree root, my ankle twisting, sending the stack of folders I was carrying flying. Papers scattered across the dusty ground like a flock of startled birds. Damn it, I muttered, crouching down to gather the mess, my face burning with embarrassment. A pair of worn leather boots entered my field of vision, stopping just inches from my hands. Need a hand. It was Cole's voice, that low rumble. I looked up. He was standing over me, his shadow falling across the scattered papers. He wasn't smiling, but the corner of his mouth was quirked in a way that might have been the distant cousin of amusement. Without waiting for my answer, he knelt down, his movements fluid and easy, and began helping me collect the pages. We worked in silence for a moment. His hands were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred, but they moved with a surprising gentleness, carefully brushing the dust from each sheet before adding it to his growing pile. I was acutely aware of his proximity. He was so close I could smell that same scent from my first day, cedar and dust and clean sweat. It was a fundamentally masculine smell, honest and uncomplicated, and it made my head swim a little. Our hands brushed as we both reached for the last folder. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact. But a jolt went through me, sharp and electric. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. He didn't react, just picked up the folder and stood, holding the neat stack of papers out to me. "Here," he said. "Thanks," I mumbled, my eyes fixed on the top button of his denim shirt. I couldn't meet his gaze. I felt transparent, as if that tiny, insignificant touch had broadcasted all my secret, foolish thoughts. "Watch your step," he said, his voice neutral. He tipped his hat a fraction of an inch and then walked away, heading toward the barn. I stood there for a long time, clutching the folders to my chest, my heart hammering. My skin still tingled where his fingers had touched mine. It was a meaningless accident, a blip, a non-event. But my overactive imagination was already at work, replaying it, analyzing it, imbuing it with a significance it couldn't possibly possess. He didn't pull his hand back. He let it linger for a fraction of a second. Or did he? Am I imagining that? Of course, I'm imagining that. It was a familiar, painful cycle of hope and self-recrimination. But as I walked the rest of the way to the bunkhouse, I couldn't shake the feeling of that brief, warm touch. It was the most human contact I'd had in months. The weeks bled into one another, marked not by dates on a calendar, but by the slow, subtle shift of the seasons. The relentless heat of late summer began to soften, the mornings carrying a new, crisp edge. The golden grasses began to fade to a paler shade of tan. My work on the ledgers progressed at a steady pace. I had developed a system, a routine that kept my hands busy and my mind, for the most part, occupied during the daylight hours. But the nights were long. It was during the evenings that the loneliness felt most acute. The other hands would often drive into the small town a half-hour away, their laughter and the rumble of their truck engine fading into the distance, leaving the ranch in an even deeper state of quiet. I'd stay in my room, trying to read, but the words on the page would blur. My thoughts would inevitably drift back to him. Cole rarely went to town. More often than not, he'd remain, a silent, watchful presence. I'd see him checking on the horses or mending a piece of tack on the porch of his small cabin, which stood a little apart from the main cluster of buildings. He seemed to prefer the solitude, a man content in his own company. We were two islands of quiet in the vast, dark sea of the plains, and yet we were worlds apart. One evening, a problem with the generator plunged the entire ranch into darkness. The outage was sudden and complete. One moment, I was sitting at my desk, the small lamp casting a pool of yellow light on a faded page. The next, I was in absolute blackness. There were a few shouts from the main house, the sound of doors opening and closing. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a blinding beacon, and made my way outside. The sky was incredible. Without the competing glare of artificial light, the stars were a brilliant, shocking spray of diamonds against black velvet. I had never seen anything like it. I stood there, mesmerized, until a beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on my feet. "You all right?" Cole's voice came from behind the flashlight beam. "Yeah, just." I gestured vaguely at the sky. "Wow," he grunted in what I took to be agreement. The beam of his flashlight moved from me to the path leading toward a small shed behind the bunkhouse. Generators probably just flooded. "I'm going to take a look." He started walking. A strange impulse took hold of me. "Do you need any help?" I asked, the words out of my mouth before I could think them through. I knew less than nothing about generators. I was more likely to make things worse. He stopped and turned, the flashlight beam illuminating my face. I could feel him studying me in the dark. I expected him to say no, to dismiss the offer from the useless city boy. But after a long pause, he just said, "Hold the light." It was a command, not an invitation, but my heart leaped anyway. I followed him to the shed, the beam of my phone shaking slightly in my hand. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and oil. He handed me his heavy-duty flashlight. "Keep it steady on the engine." For the next hour, I did just that. I stood beside him in the cramped space, holding the light while he worked. He moved with a quiet, focused intensity, his hands sure and knowing as they manipulated wrenches and wires. I watched the play of muscles in his forearms as he tightened a bolt, the concentration etched on his face, illuminated in the stark glare of the beam I held. He didn't speak much, just occasional, clipped requests. Hand me that socket wrench. The half-inch, or shift the light a little to the left. I was useless, a human lampstand, but it didn't matter. We were a team, however lopsided. We were sharing a space, a task. The air was cool, but the small shed seemed to hold a pocket of warmth, a heat that radiated from his body. We were so close that our shoulders brushed a few times. Each time, that same electric jolt went through me, but I didn't pull away. I held my ground. I held the light steady. He talked me through what he was doing, his voice a low monologue more for himself than for me. Fuel lines clear. Spark plug looks fouled, though. That's probably it. He worked with a patient, methodical rhythm, cleaning the plug, checking the connections. I found myself listening not just to the words, but to the sound of his breathing, the soft scrape of metal on metal, the small, intimate sounds of his labor. Finally, he wiped his hands on a rag. All right, give it a try now, he nodded toward the pull cord. Give it a good, hard pull. I hesitated. He must have seen it in my face. Just pull straight back. You got it. His confidence in me was both terrifying and exhilarating. I braced myself, grabbed the handle, and pulled with all my might. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life with a deafening clatter. A second later, the bare bulb overhead flickered on, flooding the small shed with harsh, yellow light. The lights across the ranch came on with it. We stood there for a moment in the sudden noise and light, blinking at each other. His face was smudged with grease, and his hair was slightly damp with sweat. A small, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time since I'd met him. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines and making his eyes crinkle at the corners. See? Told you, he said, his voice nearly lost in the engine's roar. My own answering grin felt wide and foolish. I didn't do anything. You held the light, he said, and the way he said it, it sounded like the most important job in the world. That night, as I lay in my bed, the familiar hum of electricity a comforting presence, I couldn't stop replaying that moment in my head. You held the light. It was a simple statement of fact, but it felt like more. It felt like an acknowledgement, a small crack in the wall between our two separate worlds. He had let me in, just a little, and in the darkness of the shed, standing shoulder to shoulder, I had felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I had felt useful. I had felt seen. And for the first time since arriving at this dusty, isolated place, I felt a flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope. The incident with the generator subtly shifted the dynamic between us. It wasn't a seismic change, nothing anyone else would have noticed. But I noticed. The air between us felt less charged with my own one-sided tension and more with a kind of shared, unspoken understanding. His brief glances across the dinner table seemed to last a fraction of a second longer. Occasionally, if our paths crossed in the yard, he would offer a quiet, "Mornin', Leo," instead of just a nod. Each of these small gestures was a breadcrumb, and I gathered them greedily. One Saturday, he was tasked with driving into town for supplies, a trip that usually fell to one of the younger hands. As I was leaving the main house after breakfast, his truck rumbled to a stop beside me. He leaned across the passenger seat and rolled down the window. "I'm heading into town," he said, his elbow resting on the open window frame. "Heard you mention you needed some things." I had mentioned it, in passing, to Martha a few days ago. I needed toothpaste and some new pens. The idea that this small, insignificant detail had traveled from her to him sent a ridiculous thrill through me. Yeah, I do. Get in," he said. It was another one of his simple, undeniable commands. "No sense you taking your car." My heart did a little stutter step. A half-hour drive into town with him. A half-hour back. An entire hour, alone with Cole. It felt like a monumental gift. I walked around the front of the truck and climbed into the passenger seat. The cab of his truck was an extension of him. It was clean but not sterile, smelling of leather, coffee, and the faint, dusty scent of the land. A pair of worn leather gloves sat on the dashboard. The radio was off. The only sounds were the powerful rumble of the engine and the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. We drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. It wasn't an awkward silence, not like the ones I usually found myself in. It was a comfortable, settled quiet. I stared out the window at the rolling landscape, the endless fence posts flashing by in a hypnotic rhythm. I was intensely aware of him beside me. The way his large, capable hand rested on the gearshift, the solid presence of his shoulder just a foot from my own. He broke the silence first. "So, the books," he said, his eyes on the road. "You finding anything interesting in there?" The question surprised me. I didn't think he had any interest in my dusty work. "Some things," I said, glad to have a topic I could speak on with some authority. "It's mostly what you'd expect. Records of sales, supply costs. But sometimes you find little notes in the margins. One of the original foremen, a guy from the 1890s, used to sketch horses next to the entries. He was pretty good." Cole listened, his expression thoughtful. "My great-grandfather was a foreman here," he said quietly. "Name was Thomas." I straightened up. "Thomas Blackwood? I've seen his name everywhere." He kept the most detailed logs of anyone. A flicker of something, pride, maybe, passed over Cole's face. "Yeah, that was him. He was born on this land. Died on it, too." The conversation flowed more easily after that. He asked me questions about my work, and his questions were smart, perceptive. He wanted to know about the people, not just the numbers. He wanted to know about the droughts and the hard winters I was reading about. I realized he wasn't just making small talk. He had a deep, abiding connection to this place and its history. It was in his blood. He asked me about the city, too. "What's a guy who reads old books do for fun back there?" I shrugged, a little self-conscious. "Museums, mostly. Old movie theaters. Walk around a lot." I didn't mention the quiet, lonely nights in my small apartment, the feeling of being invisible in a city of millions. "You got family back there?" he asked, his tone casual, but the question felt pointed. "No, not really. Just some distant cousins I never see." "Anyone else?" he pressed, his voice still even. "Waiting on you." My breath caught in my throat. There it is. The question. It's a simple, friendly inquiry. But it feels like a probe, a carefully aimed dart. My hands are clammy. He's asking if I have a girlfriend. Just say no. It's easy. It's the truth. But the word no feels like it's caught behind a wall of unspoken truths. Saying no feels like a lie of omission. Saying anything else feels like a terrifying leap. "No." I finally managed to say, my voice a little tight. "No one's waiting." He just nodded, his eyes still on the road, but I saw the muscles in his jaw work for a second. The silence that fell between us this time felt different. It was heavier, filled with the things I hadn't said. I stared out my window, my reflection a ghostly, anxious stranger looking back at me. I felt like I had been tested and had, in some crucial way, failed. In town, we went our separate ways with a plan to meet back at the truck in an hour. I bought my toothpaste and pins in a haze, my mind replaying that short, loaded exchange over and over. He had been digging, I was sure of it. But why? Was it simple curiosity? Or was it something more? The hope that had been flickering inside me was now warring with a familiar, crushing anxiety. When I got back to the truck, he was already there, leaning against the driver's side door, watching the sparse foot traffic on the main street. He pushed off the door as I approached. "Get everything?" he asked. "Yeah. You." He just nodded toward the bed of the truck, which was loaded with sacks of feed and boxes of supplies. The drive back was as quiet as the first part of the drive out, but the quality of the silence had changed again. It was no longer comfortable. It was taut, stretched thin with unspoken questions. I felt his gaze on me a few times, but when I turned to look, he was always watching the road. The space between us and the cab of the truck felt both immense and suffocatingly small. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but I had no idea what to say. What could I possibly say? "By the way, the reason I got weird when you asked if someone was waiting is because I'm gay, and I've been nursing a colossal, hopeless crush on you since the day I got here." Yeah, that would go over well. So I said nothing. We drove the rest of the way back to the ranch in that charged, heavy silence. And when he dropped me off at the bunkhouse, his "see you at dinner" sounded clipped and distant. I watched him drive away toward his cabin, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I had been given a gift, an hour alone with him, and I had managed to ruin it. The small bridge that had been building between us felt like it had been washed away. A few days after the tense trip to town, a cold front swept in, bringing with it a low, bruised-looking sky and a biting wind that carried the first real promise of winter. The easy rhythm of the ranch shifted. The work became more urgent, a race against the weather to secure the last of the hay and reinforce the shelters for the animals. There was a new energy in the air, a sense of shared purpose that I was, as always, on the periphery of. I was in my office, trying to concentrate on a ledger detailing the brutal winter of 1912, when I heard a commotion from the yard. Two of the younger hands, a pair of brothers named Dean and Cody, were shouting at each other, their voices sharp and angry. It was something about a gate left unlatched and a handful of calves getting into the wrong pasture. It was the kind of petty squabble that happened all the time. I tried to ignore it, but then the argument took a different, uglier turn. I heard my name. "Always watching," Cody was saying, his voice full of derision. "Sitting up in his window like some kind of weirdo. Gives me the creeps." "Leave it," Dean said, his voice lower. "Cole says he's just here to do a job." "Yeah, well, I don't like it," Cody shot back, his voice rising. "He's not right. You see the way he looks at things? It's like he's a goddamn librarian at a rodeo. And you know what they say about guys like that from the city? All soft and queer." The word hung in the cold air. Queer. It was thrown out like a piece of trash, casual and venomous. My blood went cold. I froze, my hand hovering over the delicate page of the ledger. I felt like a bug under a microscope, pinned and exposed. I stopped breathing, waiting for the next blow. But it didn't come. Instead, a new voice cut through the tension, low and quiet, but carrying an authority that instantly silenced them. "That's enough." It was Cole. I couldn't see him from my window, but I knew his voice. I could picture him perfectly, standing there, his expression unreadable, his presence alone enough to quell the dispute. Cody started to stammer. "I heard you," Cole said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "His name is Leo, and he works for this ranch, same as you. The only thing you need to be concerned with is the job you're paid to do. And right now, that job is fixing the mess you made with those calves. Get to it." There was a moment of silence, and then the sound of shuffling feet and muttered apologies. The confrontation was over as quickly as it had begun. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my body trembling. I felt a confusing mix of emotions, the sting of Cody's words, a wave of shame, and a surge of profound, overwhelming gratitude. He had defended me. He hadn't made a big show of it. He hadn't mentioned the slur. He had simply shut it down with a quiet, steely finality. He had drawn a line in the dirt and put me on his side of it. That evening, I skipped dinner. I couldn't face them. I couldn't face him. I stayed in my room, the lights off, and watched the sky fade from gray to black. The wind howled around the corners of the bunkhouse, a lonely, mournful sound that matched the turmoil inside me. I felt raw, exposed. Cole's defense of me had been a balm, but it had also highlighted my own weakness, my own silence. A sharp knock on my door made me jump. I didn't answer. I didn't want to see anyone. The knock came again, firmer this time. "Leo." It was his voice. My heart hammered against my ribs. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. There was a long pause. I heard a soft sigh from the other side of the door. "Martha sent you a plate," he said, his voice softer now. "I'll leave it on the porch rail." I heard the faint scrape of a plate being set down, and then the sound of his footsteps retreating down the porch. I waited until the sound had completely faded before I moved. I opened the door a crack. A plate, covered with foil, sat on the railing. It was still warm. I brought it inside but didn't eat. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, the plate on my lap, and thought about the man who had brought it to me, the man who had defended me, the man who had, with a few quiet words, made me feel more protected than I had ever felt in my entire life. The wall I had so carefully constructed around my heart was beginning to crumble, and the thought terrified me more than any ugly word ever could. The air between us for the next few days was thick with unspoken things. After the incident with the other hands and the silent offering of dinner, a new layer of complexity had been added to our interactions. We were back to nods and brief greetings, but they felt different now. They were freighted with the memory of his quiet defense. When his eyes met mine across the yard, there was an intensity there that stole my breath, a searching quality that made me feel he was looking straight into the heart of me. I found myself both seeking him out and avoiding him. I would linger at my office window, hoping for a glimpse of him crossing the yard. But if I saw him walking toward the main house when I was about to leave, I would wait, my heart pounding, until he had passed. I was a coward. He had stood up for me, and I couldn't even meet his gaze. I was drowning in my own gratitude and fear. The tipping point came on a Friday night. A storm was rolling in, the sky a turbulent sea of dark purple and gray. Most of the hands had taken their pay and headed into town, eager to get there before the rain started. The ranch fell into a deep, expectant quiet. I was restless, unable to focus on my book. The wind was picking up, rattling the window frame in my small room. I decided to walk, to feel the wild energy of the approaching storm. I ended up near the corrals, leaning against the top rail of a fence, the same one I'd often seen him sitting on. The wood was smooth and worn under my hands. The wind whipped my hair across my face and smelled of rain and damp earth. It felt cleansing, like it might blow away some of the anxiety that was constantly buzzing under my skin. I don't know how long I stood there before I sensed him. He didn't make a sound, but the atmosphere shifted the way the air changes just before a lightning strike. I turned my head, and he was there, standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his hat pulled down low against the wind. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost in the rising wind. "I know," I said. "I like it." He moved to the fence and leaned against it beside me, our shoulders not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. We stood in silence for a long time, watching the clouds churn and boil in the distance. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splatting into the dust around our feet. "You should go in," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's going to break any minute." "I'm fine." He finally turned his head and looked at me. His face was in shadow, impossible to read, but the line of his jaw was tight. "Leo," he said, and my name on his lips was both a warning and a plea. "Thank you," I blurted out, the words rushing out of me before I could stop them. "For the other day, with Cody, and for the dinner. Thank you." He didn't say, "You're welcome," or "Don't mention it." He just held my gaze, the silence stretching out, punctuated by the wind and the spattering rain. He took a step closer, then another. He was standing directly in front of me now, his body blocking the wind. The world seemed to shrink to the space between us. "You didn't have to skip dinner," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "This is your place as much as theirs." My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The rain was coming faster now, plastering his denim shirt to his shoulders, slicking my hair to my forehead. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was look at him, at the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, at the impossible blue of his eyes. He set his shoulders to the fence, one on either side of my head, effectively pinning me there. It wasn't an aggressive move. It was a deliberate, grounding one. He was anchoring us in the rising storm. He slowly reached up and took off his hat, his movements measured and calm. The rain immediately darkened his hair. He looked at the hat in his hands for a moment. Then, with that same unnerving deliberation, he gently tipped it and set it on my chest, the brim resting just below my collarbones. My breath hitched. The weight of it, though slight, felt immense. It was a shield, an offering, a confession. It was the most eloquent, nonverbal statement I had ever heard. My hands came up of their own accord and rested on his arms, my fingers gripping the damp denim. He lowered his head, and the last few inches of space between us disappeared. His lips met mine. It wasn't a hard kiss, or a demanding one. It was soft, questioning. It tasted of rain and whiskey and something that was just him. It was a release of all the tension, all the stolen glances, all the unspoken words that had been arcing between us for months. It was slow and deep and utterly overwhelming. I responded without thinking, my body acting on a need so profound it had become a part of my very structure. My fingers tightened on his arms, pulling him closer. The hat on my chest was a warm, solid pressure against my heart. It was a tangible piece of him, a claim. When he finally pulled back, it was only an inch. His forehead rested against mine. His eyes were closed. The rain was coming down in sheets now, soaking us completely, but I didn't feel the cold. All I felt was the searing heat where his lips had been, the solid presence of his body in front of me, and the steady, reassuring weight of his hat on my chest. "Cole," I whispered, the name a ragged breath. "I know," he breathed back. And in those two words, I heard everything. I heard the answer to the question in the truck. I heard the reason for his quiet defense. I heard the echo of my own long-held, secret yearning. He knew, and he hadn't run. He had walked straight into the storm and met me there. We stood like that for a long time as the sky opened up and washed the world clean. Two solitary figures, no longer islands, but a shared and solid shore against the rain. The walk back to the bunkhouse was a daze. The rain had lessened to a steady, soaking drizzle. Cole walked beside me, his hand a warm, firm presence on the small of my back, guiding me through the darkness. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened, for the monumental shift that had occurred at the fence line. The silence wasn't empty. It was brimming with the kiss, with the feeling of his forehead against mine, with the quiet finality of his "I know." He walked me to my door. Under the dim yellow light of the porch lamp, I could see the water running in rivulets down his face, dripping from his chin. His hair was plastered to his head. He looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. "You should get dry," he said, his voice still low and rough. He didn't move his hand from my back. "You too," I managed to say, my own voice sounding distant, unfamiliar. He just nodded, his eyes searching mine, as if looking for confirmation, for reassurance that what had happened was real. I must have given him what he was looking for, because a small, almost imperceptible tension left his shoulders. He finally dropped his hand, the loss of his touch an immediate, aching cold. He gave me one last, long look, then turned and disappeared into the rainy darkness without another word. I stumbled into my room, my clothes dripping water onto the wooden floor. I leaned back against the closed door, my legs weak. I slowly slid down to the floor, my head reeling. I could still feel the weight of his hat on my chest, though it was gone now. I could still taste the rain on his lips. My mind, usually a chaotic storm of overanalysis, was blessedly, shockingly quiet. There was nothing to analyze. It had happened. It was real. The fantasy I had so carefully constructed in the lonely corners of my mind had walked out of my dreams and kissed me in the rain. I woke the next morning to the sound of a world scrubbed clean. The sun was streaming through my window, making the lingering puddles in the yard glitter. For a moment, a blissful, groggy moment, I forgot. Then it all came rushing back. The wind, the rain, the fence, the kiss. A hot flush of mingled panic and elation spread through me. What now? My anxiety, which had been so mercifully absent the night before, returned with a vengeance. It was a mistake. A moment of madness in the storm. He regrets it. He must regret it. I imagined the day ahead, the awkwardness at breakfast, the carefully averted eyes, the return to the familiar, painful distance. Only now it would be worse, poisoned by the memory of that one, impossible moment of closeness. I stayed in my room as long as I could, my stomach in knots. Eventually, the need for coffee outweighed my fear. I pulled on my clothes and braced myself, opening my door like a soldier peeking over a trench. The yard was busy with the usual morning activity. I saw Dean and Cody mending a section of fence. I saw Martha heading toward the chicken coop, but I didn't see Cole. The relief was so sharp it felt like disappointment. I made it to the main house and into the kitchen. The long table was empty, the breakfast rush already over. Martha was at the sink, her back to me. "There you are," she said without turning around. "Thought you were going to sleep the day away. There's coffee left in the pot. Cole was asking after you." My heart stopped. He was... "Yep," she said, finally turning, a knowing look in her eye that made me feel entirely transparent. "Said to tell you he'd be in the north pasture, checking the fences after the storm. Said you might want to ride along. See a different part of the ranch." She paused, her gaze shrewd. "It's a pretty view up there." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a command from him. It was an invitation. A choice. I could stay here, in the safety of my routine, and let last night fade into an ambiguous, unspoken memory. Or I could go. I could ride out to the north pasture and face whatever came next. My fear was a cold, heavy weight in my gut. But the memory of his kiss was aflame, and it was stronger. "Where can I find a horse?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Martha just smiled. "Cole left one saddled for you. Name's Patches. He's a gentle soul. Won't give you any trouble." Of course, he had. He had anticipated my answer. He had made it easy for me. An hour later, I was on the back of a placid, brown and white horse, following a set of fresh tracks through the damp, fragrant sagebrush. I was a terrible rider, clumsy and unbalanced. But Patches lived up to his reputation, plodding along patiently as if he understood the fragility of his cargo. I found him a few miles out, a solitary figure on horseback, silhouetted against the vast, blue sky. He was sitting still, watching me approach. As I drew closer, I could see his face. His expression was calm, steady. There was no regret in his eyes. There was only a quiet watchfulness. I pulled Patches to a stop beside his horse. The only sounds were the creak of leather and the soft sigh of the wind. The awkwardness I had dreaded was nowhere to be found. In its place was a profound, peaceful quiet. "Morning," he said, his voice the same low rumble it had always been. "Morning," I replied. He didn't say anything about last night. He didn't need to. He just gestured with his head toward the valley that spread out below us. "This is it," he said. "The view." It was beautiful. The storm had washed the air clean, and the colors of the landscape, the deep green of the grass, the red of the earth, the endless blue of the sky, were shockingly vivid. We sat there on our horses, side by side, and just looked. After a long, comfortable silence, he reached over, his movements slow and deliberate, and took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, his calloused palm warm and solid against my own. It wasn't a passionate gesture. It was simple. It was grounding. It was a quiet, undeniable statement. "This is real. I am here. I am not going anywhere." I looked at our joined hands, then up at his face. He was watching me, a small, soft smile on his lips, the same smile I had seen in the generator shed. "Slept all right?" he asked, his thumb gently stroking the back of my hand. The simple question held so much. It held the anxiety of my morning, the fear of his regret. And his touch, his smile, was the answer to all of it. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I slept great." He squeezed my hand once, a firm, reassuring pressure, and then turned his gaze back to the valley. We stayed like that for a long time, our hands clasped between our horses, two men sitting under an endless sky, the whole world spread out before us. The fear was gone. The loneliness was gone. In its place was a quiet, terrifying, wonderful certainty. This was the beginning. The weeks that followed the kiss in the rain and the ride to the north pasture were a study in quiet intimacy. Nothing and everything had changed. On the surface, our lives on the ranch continued as they always had. I spent my days with the ghosts in the ledgers, and he spent his with the living, breathing work of the land. But beneath that surface, a new current was flowing, a silent, powerful river of shared understanding that connected our two separate islands. We became experts in the art of the unspoken. Our relationship was built in the spaces between words, in small gestures that would have been invisible to anyone else, but were monumental to us. It was in the way he would leave an extra sweet apple on the porch rail for me in the mornings, knowing I liked them. It was in the way I would leave a fresh pot of coffee brewing for him when I knew he had a long night of calving ahead. It was in a brief, lingering touch as we passed in the hallway of the main house, his fingers brushing against mine, sending a familiar jolt through my entire body. The other hands noticed, of course. It was impossible for them not to. They might not have known the specifics, but they saw the shift. The charged space around Cole now included me. The quiet foreman, who had always held himself slightly apart, now had a fixed point of orbit. There were sideways glances, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Cody avoided my gaze entirely, but no one said a word. Cole's quiet authority, the unspoken line he had drawn in the dirt that day, held fast. His presence was a shield, and I walked in its shadow, feeling safer than I ever had. Our time alone was stolen in quiet moments. Late-night walks under the brilliant canopy of stars, where he would point out the constellations, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. We would stand close, our shoulders touching, his arms sometimes resting lightly around my waist. We didn't need to talk much. We would just stand and breathe the same cold, clean air, our silence a comfortable blanket. Sometimes, I would go to his cabin after everyone else was asleep. It was a small, simple place, as unadorned and functional as the man himself. It smelled of him, of leather and wood smoke and coffee. We would sit at his small kitchen table and talk for hours. I would tell him about the books I'd read, the cities I'd seen. He would tell me about the ranch, about the rhythms of the seasons, about the language of horses and cattle. He spoke of the land as if it were a living thing, a demanding but ultimately fair partner in a lifelong dance. In these moments, his stoic exterior would soften. I saw the deep well of gentleness in him, the quiet humor that flickered in his eyes. He was a man of profound stillness, and I, who had spent my life in a state of restless, anxious motion, found an incredible peace in his presence. He was my anchor. He was my quiet. One night, sitting in his cabin, a log shifting in the wood stove, he reached across the table and took my hand. He turned it over and traced the lines on my palm with his rough finger. My hands were soft, the hands of a man who worked with paper, not earth. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked quietly, his eyes fixed on my hand. "When the books are done?" The question hung in the warm, quiet air. It was the question I had been deliberately avoiding for weeks. My 3 months were nearly up. My job, the thing that had brought me here, was coming to an end. Soon, I would have no reason to stay. The thought of leaving, of returning to my old life, or what was left of it, was a physical ache in my chest. My old life felt like a foreign country now, a place I no longer had a passport for. My home was here, in the quiet of this small cabin, with this man's hand holding mine. "I try not to," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. He looked up from my hand, his blue eyes meeting mine. His gaze was steady, intense. "You could stay," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a possibility he was laying on the table for me to consider. "As what?" I asked, a bitter, self-deprecating laugh escaping me. "I can't ride. I can't fix a fence. The most useful I've ever been on this ranch was holding a flashlight." "We can always use someone to hold the light," he said, his voice soft but firm. He squeezed my hand. "I can teach you the rest." The sincerity in his voice, the simple, unwavering belief he had in me, undid me. I felt a stinging in my eyes. I had spent so much of my life feeling fundamentally incapable, out of place. And here was this man, this solid, competent man, telling me he could teach me how to belong. He was offering me not just a place, but a purpose, a future. I didn't answer right away. The weight of his offer, the sheer, terrifying beauty of it, was too much for words. I just looked at him, my heart full to bursting. He was offering me a key to his world. All I had to do was be brave enough to take it. The final week of my contract was a time of quiet reflection. I finished cataloging the last of the ledgers, my task complete. The boxes were neatly labeled, ready for the historical society. My reason for being here was officially over. A palpable sense of an ending hung in the air. I hadn't given Cole my answer, and he hadn't pushed for one. He simply gave me the space to think, his quiet presence a constant, reassuring backdrop to my internal turmoil. My old life called to me with the weak, ghostly pull of familiarity. I could go back. I could get a new apartment, find a new job in a library or a museum. I could slip back into the comfortable anonymity of the city, back into the quiet loneliness I knew so well. It was the safe choice. It was the easy choice. But when I closed my eyes, I didn't see city streets or dusty archives. I saw the vast, open sky of the plains. I smelled sagebrush after a rain. I felt the solid warmth of Cole's hand in mine. My life before the ranch felt like a black and white photograph. My life here was in vibrant, shocking color. To go back would be to choose to be a ghost again. On my last day, I packed my few belongings into the same bags I had arrived with. The room looked as Spartan and empty as it had on my first day, but it felt entirely different. It was no longer a stranger's room. It was the room where my life had begun again. I carried my bags out to my car, the same dark blue sedan that now looked even more out of place, covered in a thick layer of dust. I saw Cole leaning against the porch railing of his cabin, watching me. He didn't move, didn't call out. He just watched, his expression unreadable from this distance. My heart twisted. This was it, the moment of decision. I could get in the car and drive away, and he would let me go. He would not ask me to stay again. It had to be my choice, a conscious choice. I put my bags down on the ground beside my car, and instead of opening the driver's side door, I started walking. I walked away from my car, away from the road that led back to my old life, and I walked toward his cabin. I walked toward him. With every step, the knot of anxiety in my stomach loosened. With every step, I felt more certain, more grounded. The dust kicked up around my boots. the same dust that had felt so alien when I arrived. Now it felt like home. I stopped a few feet in front of him. He pushed himself off the railing and stood, waiting. I didn't have a grand speech prepared. My words, when they came, were simple. "I don't know how to mend a fence," I said, my voice clear and steady. A slow smile spread across his face, that rare, beautiful smile that made his eyes crinkle. "I know," he said. "And I'm a terrible writer. I know that too." But I took a deep breath, the clean, cold air filling my lungs. "I'd like to learn." He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He didn't kiss me. He just rested his hands on my shoulders, his grip firm and sure. He looked down at me, his blue eyes full of a quiet, profound emotion that needed no words. "Good," he said, his voice thick. "The fences'll need mending come spring." It was an acceptance, a promise, a beginning. The next morning, I woke up not in the bunkhouse, but in his bed, in his cabin. The early morning light was filtering through the curtains, painting stripes across the patchwork quilt. He was already up. I could hear him moving around in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the small space. It was the most wonderfully domestic, ordinary scene I could imagine. I got up and pulled on a shirt he had left out for me. It was huge on me and smelled like him. I walked into the kitchen, and he was standing at the stove, his back to me. He turned as I entered, a spatula in his hand and that soft smile on his face. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, my heart so full I felt it might break. He didn't say anything else, just nodded toward the coffee pot. I poured myself a mug and sat down at the small table. It felt so natural, so right, as if I had been doing it every morning for years. I watched him cook, the easy, competent movements of his hands, the solid set of his shoulders. This was my life now. This quiet man. This small cabin. This vast, beautiful land. He brought 2 plates over to the table and sat down across from me. We ate in a comfortable, easy silence, the morning sun warming our faces. I looked out the window at the endless stretch of pasture, at the big sky that went on forever. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small beneath it. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was no longer a ghost, sifting through the lives of others. I was here, living my own. I had been a man who felt like a footnote in his own story, a passive observer of his own life. But Cole, with his quiet strength and unwavering gaze, had seen me. He had held the light for me, and then he had handed me a hammer and shown me how to build a home. And as I sat there, sharing a simple breakfast with the man I loved, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had finally come home.